Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Um, and so thank you for coming to this presentation. And so I am going to start in 1967 because y'all know I love me some history. Um, in 1967, Senator Ralph Yarborough um, had testimony in Congress in support of bilingual education. He said, "The time has come when we must do something about the poor schooling, low health standards, job discrimination, and the many other artificial barriers that stand in the way of the advancement of the Mexican American people." Now, while he talked about poor schooling, low health standards, job discrimination, and the many other artificial barriers, he then concluded that the most promising area for progress is in the field of education. He argued that programs designed to impart to Spanish-speaking students a knowledge of pride in their ancestral culture and language was going to help them get out of the cycle of poverty that they found themselves in. He argued that bilingual education would help them to speak both good Spanish and English and would allow them to position themselves confidently to deal with the world. A year later, the Bilingual Education Act was passed with bipartisan support. Indeed, it really wasn't controversial at all. Um, Skip 30 years, in 1999 in California, Ron Unz, another white guy, right, was now against bilingual education. He argued that bilingual education had radically changed the terms of the American social compact, replacing the emphasis on assimilation with an emphasis on ethnic difference. He argued that the goal was for Black, Latinos, and Asians to create their own separatist institutions, arguing that this was going to be the seeds of national dissolution. This eventually would lead to the banning of bilingual education in California and several other states. So, within 30 years, bilingual education went from being framed by white politicians as the solution to the challenges facing Latinx communities to being the primary problem preventing their social mobility. What happened? The traditional narrative about this debate argues that this is part of the waxing and waning of bilingual education in the United States, that this was part of a broader conservative backlash to gains of the civil rights movement, and that this is what led to the banning of bilingual education in several states. I don't disagree with that narrative. I just think that there's more to be told about what's happening here. My argument is that the demise of bilingual education really lied in its contradictory efforts to challenge the racialization of Latinx people by doubling down on this racialization in ways that reified anti-Black and white settler colonial logics. I first want to kind of be a little theoretical here and talk about kind of race, what I mean by race, and how it gets configured and reconfigured in relation to broader socio-historical processes. So, building on the work of Sylvia Wynter, I understand race to be connected to what she terms the politics of being, which is waged over what it is to be the descriptive statement of the human. Um, and so she looks at this reconfiguration across time, arguing first for man one as a discursive shift from the being a religious subject to the church to a rational political subject of the state. Within this context, indigenous populations were framed as irrational and incompatible with modernity and in need of elimination, whereas Black populations were framed as animal-like and well-suited for manual labor. There's a discursive shift that happens with the rise of the human sciences towards a construction of what she terms man two, which is a discursive shift from rationality to biology as the construction of racial hierarchy. Um, Here, indigenous populations become framed as less evolved, and Black populations slotted as the abject other. So this connects to what I particularly am interested in, which is the racialization of Latinidad in Latin America and in the US. So US imperialism positions Latin America as part of what they term the Third World, which was mapped onto existing racial hierarchies that already existed in Latin America. Latin America being a society that had been produced itself through white settler colonialism and this transatlantic slave trade. In a similar way, U.S. colonization of the American Southwest and Puerto Rico positioned Spanish speakers as a new racialized category that was also mapped onto existing racial hierarchies, again, built on societies that were already white settler colonial and built on the transatlantic slave trade. In response to both of these contexts, the populations were framed as culturally and linguistically inferior because of so-called racial impurities. And the solution for Latin America was to modernize in ways that were subordinate to and accommodated U.S. political and economic interests. Whereas in the US, Latinx people were framed as needing to assimilate in ways that are subordinate to and accommodate US political and economic interests. So I'm interested in particular in the reconfiguration of race in the post-colonial world. Here, we get a shift from Mansu's focus on biology to cultural explanations that leave the onto-epistemological foundations of biological views of race intact and do nothing to address the material consequences of this racism on the communities that were impacted by them. Here, post-colonial nations are framed as primitive and in need of modernization in the ways that indigenous communities historically and to this day continue to be framed. And racialized communities in the US were framed as having a culture of poverty that needed to be fixed. And so, from this perspective, the goal of modernizing or fixing this culture of poverty was to produce and train a cadre of professionals from these communities who would be provided contingent proximity to whiteness in exchange for accepting colonial representations of their community. This is where we get back to bilingual education. So I want to look a little bit at the national conversation that's shaping the emergence of the uncontroversial, at the time, Bilingual Education Act, right? And so on the one hand, as I was alluding to, was this idea of the culture of poverty that argued that multiple generations of poverty led to cultural pathologies that prevented racialized communities from escaping poverty. And this was used primarily by mainstream social scientists and policymakers to develop programs that were designed to fix these cultural pathologies. In contrast, a cultural maintenance perspective, which is oftentimes framed as in opposition to that, although when I get to it, we'll see maybe not so much. The argument was that multiple generations of racial oppression had led racialized communities to be disconnected from their cultural identities. So still broken in some ways, right? But disconnected. And this was primarily used by civil rights activists to promote more culturally and affirming educational approaches. So both of these perspectives supported the development of bilingual education, albeit from perhaps slightly different perspectives. Bilingual education from the culture of poverty was seen as an approach to fix Mexican American students, whereas bilingual education from a cultural maintenance perspective was also seen on some level as fixing the cultural loss of Mexican and Puerto Rican students. And so I'm particularly interested in thinking through the sociolinguistic ideologies that provided the foundation of the culture of poverty and cultural maintenance perspective. So when I look at the discourses at the time period, from a sociolinguistic perspective, African Americans were framed in the discourse as having no additional language that could even be incorporated into remediation or maintained. There was literally nothing that the discourse suggested there was to maintain for African Americans. Whereas for Native Americans, they were framed as, for the most part, having no additional language with a legitimate literary tradition that could be incorporated into their remediation or maintained without modernization and standardization. And so some exceptions to this rule become Navajo, which is framed in this discourse as one that fits what it means to be a modern language. But for languages that are framed as not fitting what it means to be a modern language, there is no need for bilingual education because there's literally nothing to maintain from this perspective, right? And so, in contrast, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, which are the two groups that we're talking about for the most part in the 1960s, right, were framed as having an additional language that did have a legitimate literary tradition that could be incorporated into their remediation or that could be maintained. But the way that they were represented in the discourse was primarily as semilingual rather than bilingual, meaning that if they were going to maintain the language, they first had to remediate it. Remediation comes first, and then you can maintain it. Um, and so this connects to the work of Jim Cummings, who developed the framework of semilingualism within the context of this broader conversation. And this is the way he describes semilingualism. He describes it as, just kind of the short part here, as individuals who know two languages poorly. The idea being that using the culture of poverty discourses, that they came from homes that didn't have rich linguistic resources in them, and that led them to not develop native-like proficiency in any language. So I just kind of want to put this all together before I get to the second part of the presentation. And so Bilingual education is proposed as a linguistic solution to the political and economic problems, right? And aligned with a broader shift towards cultural explanations for global racial inequities. And the core of US debates around bilingual education were cultural poverty versus cultural maintenance. I argue that cultural poverty and cultural maintenance are really two sides of the same coin that both inherit long-standing colonial logics. Cultural maintenance as being only possible for groups with connections to a named language with a legitimate literary tradition, and a legitimate literary tradition not being sufficient for US Latinx people who are framed as needing to have their bilingualism fixed before it can be maintained. So now I'm in New York in 1970. And here we have Richie Perez, who was a member of the Young Lords, who were a Puerto Rican nationalist organization that were connected to really radical politics, and kind of working in solidarity with racialized groups around the country. And so in 1970, in their newsletter, he calls for communities to take over the schools, right? He says that the schools belong to us, not to them being the administrators and teachers that don't care and don't teach. And he calls for making revolution inside the school. And so moving almost 25 years later to New Jersey in 1994, Latinx parents were protesting mandated transitional bilingual education that was the policy at the time in New Jersey. And there was a bill proposed in state legislature to provide more choices for parents so that they weren't forced into transitional bilingual education if that was not what they thought was in the best interest of their child. In response to this legislation, Jose Ramos, who was one of the co-directors of the North Jersey Bilingual Council, argued, why should we require parents unfamiliar with our educational system to make such a monumental decision when we are trained to make these decisions? Certainly a contrast to calling for revolution within the schools. So within 25 years, Latinx activists went from framing bilingual education as part of broader political struggles against mainstream institutions to framing bilingual education as a technocratic solution to fixing cultural and linguistic deficiencies of Latinx students that their families themselves maybe didn't even understand. How did that happen? Well, I'm going to tell you how that happened. So it happens through the professionalizing of bilingual education, right? And there are a series of things that are produced within funding from the Bilingual Education Act that are part of efforts to professionalize the field. One of these are Title VII fellowship programs that were designed to support Latinx educators in pursuing doctorates so that they can become bilingual education researchers, policymakers, curriculum designers, others doing work in bilingual education. There's also the creation of the Office of Bilingual Education under the BEA that provided support that supported district capacity building for bilingual education. And there was also the development of the National Advisory Council for Bilingual Education that was charged with advising the OBE and federal bureaucracies on how best to implement bilingual education in ways that were aligned to research. And so this led to an explosion of funding, federal funding for bilingual education in the 1970s from 7.5 million to 160 million. In addition, 30 states enacted bilingual education legislation, and 22 of these states provided their own funding to support these programs. So bilingual education, through this funding mechanisms, becomes framed as a legitimate area with associated funding for Latinx people looking, one, for social mobility, right? But two, also for looking for a way to support Latinx students, right? And so bilingual education becomes one mechanism for them to be able to do that. that isn't where other options aren't necessarily available for them, right? There's not funding to support Latinx students. There's funding to support bilingual education, and so they get professionally funneled into bilingual education. And so they now have to grapple with this tension between wanting cultural maintenance when semilingualism was produced through discourses of the culture of poverty, right? And so what happens is this shift away from discussing semilingualism, which this is Jim Cummings in 2000, arguing that there appears to be relatively little dispute about the existence of the phenomenon. I would dispute that claim. I think some of us do dispute the existence of the phenomenon. But he then frames it around limited access to academic literate registers in both L1 and L2. And this becomes a way for those who are kind of interested in cultural maintenance to develop a framing that seems different than semilingualism, but I would argue is actually not that different. And so the argument is that coercive relations of power had led to subtractive bilingualism for many Latinx students, where Spanish was gradually replaced with English, and that additive bilingualism would be able to challenge these coercive relations of power by ensuring these students developed academic language in Spanish that they could transfer to English, right? And so this, to me, and my reading of it, is still they need to be remediated first before they have something that's worth maintaining, right? There's also the racialization of bureaucracy that begins to emerge as we get more Latinx people and other racialized people into bureaucratic positions, because this is happening not just in bilingual education, right? And so the war on poverty developed an active role for the federal government in developing a social safety net. This led to the political incorporation of racialized leaders into government and government adjacent bureaucratic structures that did not fundamentally transform their racialized status. And so this shifted from the argument of the racialization of the bureaucracy, argued that this was shifting from protecting the public interest towards the imposition of a divisive political agenda. And so you can see this through Secretary Bennett's nominees to the National Advisory Council on Bilingual Education, Secretary Bennett being the director of the Department of Education that was nominated by Ronald Reagan, right? So he nominates people to the National Advisory Council on Bilingual Education that refer to bilingual education as the new Latin hustle or as linguistic bondage, right? And so bilingual education theory then becomes framed through a racialized agenda as well, right? And so Christine Rossell, who was a political scientist, kind of speaks back to this idea of additive bilingualism by arguing that people get absolutely hysterical over how kids will be cognitively deprived if they're not taught in their native tongue. And the argument here is that while bilingual education, principles of bilingual education are supposedly universal, bilingual education is basically just Spanish, right? The idea being that Spanish-speaking students are uniquely broken and need to be fixed by bilingual education in ways that other communities don't. This idea also gets taken up by Glenn Garvin, who was a journalist, who calls what I call cultural maintenance facilitation theory. And he argued that it gave a patina of intellectual respectability, not only to bilingual education, but to gringo bashing, right? And argued that this further strengthened the entrenched bureaucracy of bilingual education that was more invested in protecting the livelihood of the Latinx professionals working in bilingual education, as opposed to serving the best interest of Latinx students. And so now we're in Los Angeles in 1996. We have this kind of racialized representation of the agenda of bilingual education activists, most of whom are Latinx. And then we have a parent boycott of a Los Angeles public school led by Episcopalian priest Alice Callaghan, who demanding English-only instruction. This was used by Ron Unz, who I introduced earlier in the presentation, and his supporters as part of building momentum for Proposition 227 that successfully banned bilingual education in California. So Alice Callaghan argued that the students that she was working with couldn't speak English and their Spanish was a mess, right? Which is really not that different than semilingual discourses. And the principal of the school argued that the complaints were initiated by Alice Callaghan. I remember, so this happened a little bit before I started college, but when I went to college and learned about this history, I remember thinking, yes, these are parents that were duped. They're being manipulated by Alice Callaghan and other white people to be against their own interest. I adopted that same framework, right, that I'm now critically interrogating. Um, but one of the mothers at the time, as I looked back at some of it, insisted that no one was forcing her to boycott. No one was forcing her to pull her kid out of the school. She said, we're the ones who wanted to do it. Another mother kind of speculated in what I think is a fair question, saying, they don't even have enough books for all the children. How can I teach them two languages? So this is a mother who's noting the material disparities between what her children are receiving and what other children are receiving. And she's telling people, you're telling me that providing them instruction in Spanish is the solution to this? I don't think so. And so I wonder if rather than these parents being the dupes, maybe those of us who accepted deficit narratives as a way of trying to provide resources that we thought these communities needed were actually duped. So putting it all together, so key components in professionalizing bilingual education was through its bureaucratization that recruited Latinx leaders to accept long-standing colonial logics in exchange for contingent acceptance into these structures. This bureaucratization served to distance Latinx professionals from community struggles through focus on technocratic knowledge over lived experience, even as their racialization still positioned them as a threat to the public interest, right? So they were kind of like trying to do things the right way, right? You're learning in school and you're using those theories to try to change the world, and you're still framed as if you're doing something that's going to completely destroy society, right? Um, and of course, this connects to broader efforts at bureaucratizing the demands of the civil rights movement while maintaining the racialization of professionals and the communities that they purport to represent, right? And so now, the last part of the presentation, we're back in DC in 1970, and we have Joshua Fishman here, who many of you know, who is quite prolific scholar and advocate for bilingual education and for cultural maintenance. Um, he argued for the day where we would have more genuine bilingual education, right? Where regardless of income, mother tongue, or language dominance, people would have access to bilingual education. That it would not just be a promissory note to the poor. It would be available to my children and grandchildren, being his children and grandchildren, right? It's too good to keep from all of the people. So this kind of discourse of bilingual education for all sounds good in theory, right? But I think the implementation of it has been a bit more fraught than that. So this is me in 2014 when I still had glasses. Uh, and I was working with the School District of Philadelphia to expand its dual language programs, which adopted this philosophy of trying to make bilingual education available to all students who wanted it, right? And so as I was presenting about the benefits of dual language education to parents at a school in a gentrifying neighborhood where there was great energy and excitement for the program, a white mother described wanting her children to be trilingual in English and Spanish for the program and Mandarin from their nanny. And she asked about what the research says in terms of students learning multiple languages, right? And of course, I was able to point her through my professional training to research that shows that learning multiple languages is a benefit. There's no evidence that there's any kind of delays or any type of kind of academic challenges that people confront in the long run, right? So I have research that can support her goal. And school two, which was in a hyper-segregated, low-poverty area, primarily Latinx area, a Puerto Rican mother described being homeless for several months. And she wasn't sure what a dual language program was, but she thought and wondered and asked us if it was like a special program that would help support her daughter through the trauma of having been homeless for multiple months. I didn't have research that I could point her to, right? I don't know what to tell her. We point her to the guidance counselor, right? We kind of try to connect her to agencies in the community that might be able to help her with her housing instability. But I, as someone who's become professionalized into bilingual education, I don't have research that can help her to support her in her need, and to say, well, bilingual education for all seems like a hollow call in the moment of that conversation, right? And just to kind of add some fuel to the fire here, while this initiative was happening, a reporter from a local newspaper wanted to cover it. She was kind of excited about this idea of dual language education. And I spoke with her for like a long time about it. And I begged her not to frame it in the way that she framed it, which was so hashtag is for Philadelphia education. Programs use the promise of a bilingual education to bring parents back to public schools. What about the parents that are already there? Right? Where are they? And what parents are we talking about here? Right? And why is that not being named here or in the article? Right? And of course, I let the reporter know I was unhappy, but she told me that the story I wanted to tell wasn't like a story that, right, it's not catchy and it's not something that she could sell papers with. I was like, not my field, okay. So within 50 years, the idea of bilingual education being for everyone went from being a radical idea, which it was when Fishman was saying it, right? The idea that everyone should get bilingual education, super radical, right? And I don't mean to suggest that he wasn't radical or visionary at the time, um, to one that was being used to systematically displace Latinx students. Bilingual education was originally designed to fix, right? Um, Plot twist, right? We didn't see that coming. Although some people did see that coming, like Guadalupe Valdez, but not everyone saw that coming. I have to be a little irreverent up here, so what's happening here is another reconfiguration of race in the neoliberal world, right? Through processes that Mike Mena and Ofelia Garcia call converse racialization, which is defined as the separation of racialized cultural and linguistic practices from their communities that are reframed as unmarked mobile resources for the consumption of affluent white people. And so affluent white people are framed as multicultural global citizens, right? Because they know different languages, they're introduced to different cultures, they're very open-minded, great. But racialized people are handicapped by their own monoculturalism or through other historical cultural deficiencies. So the culture of poverty doesn't go away, right? It's still there. But now language has become for them and not these people who are just too broken to actually benefit from it, right? So this converts race into a form of diversity that can be sold on the global marketplace. And this kind of continues the political incorporation of a cadre of professional racialized leaders who are able to successfully commodify their diversity into the corporate governance structure, right? And so we can see converse racialization in Proposition 58, which was passed finally 20 plus years after Proposition 227 banned bilingual education. Proposition 58 brought it back in a landslide, right? It wasn't even close. People knew that it was going to be overturned. And converse racialization is at the core of the proposition when you look at it, which is, of course, connected to broader national movement towards the promotion of dual language education or bilingual education for all. And so you can see in the proposition itself, English, Mandarin, and Spanish are critical to the state's economic, trade, and diplomatic efforts. So what's interesting, tangent, in the 1960s, there's very little mention of Asian Americans in the debates on bilingual education. I saw one mention in the congressional testimonies, and it was about how Chinese people didn't really need it because they were so hardworking, right? So the model minority stereotype is starting to emerge in the 1960s. There isn't really much mention, but now, with converse racialization, Mandarin becomes like the language of business, a sexy language, one that you can teach to people who can become multicultural, right? And they argues that like corporations are actively recruiting multilingual employees, right? And that bilingual education will be able to help students become more competitive in a global economy, right? So there isn't really a sense of desire for racial equity in the actual discourse of Proposition 58. Now, that's not to say that there weren't kind of desires for racial equity for some of the people who were promoting the repeal of bilingual education, but in the proposition itself that people have to vote on, there really isn't mention of racial equity at all. It's all about kind of developing multilingual skills, multicultural skills in order to become competitive in the global marketplace. And so you can develop a bipartisan consensus around that, it would seem, at least in California. Um, and so we can see converse racialization in Holyoke. Not to pick on Holyoke here, I don't have any problems with Holyoke, but when I was doing my research, I found this example, and it just seemed like really like what I'm trying to point to here. So in 2014, Holyoke in Massachusetts started a dual language program, which would eventually extend into a dual language school. And the EL director at the time argued it's a certain type of student who can come in and embrace the many ways that it was challenging. The curriculum is pretty fast paced, right? So this is not bilingual education as remediation anymore, which it was in the 60s. This is bilingual education as enrichment, as gifted education for students who can keep up with it. I think we know who the students who can keep up with it are, right? And you can see that starting here, which is if you tell an English-speaking family that their child can be bilingual in 4 years at no additional cost to them, it's a very exciting opportunity. If you ask a parent in any city across the country, I think they'd answer the same question. If you ask a parent, so again, you see English-speaking family and a parent being used as synonymous when not all parents are English-speaking, right? But and of course, as no surprise, right, of the 23 students who entered the program in the first year, 7 came from homes that were Spanish dominant, with the remaining having little to no exposure to Spanish before school. So students who come from homes where Spanish is spoken are apparently not able to keep up with the curriculum where half of the instruction is in Spanish, but those who come from homes where no Spanish is spoken can keep up with that curriculum better. And then we have kind of, just to kind of show you kind of the continuities of the discourse, in 2019, we have a dual language teacher working at the school argue that if you want to learn another language, you have to go abroad and do an exchange or visit and immerse yourself in that culture. Again, who's the you that's being talked about here? Some people come from places where they've already learned these languages, right? Here, you don't have to do that because the students are getting the firsthand experience. So you can see the discourse is primarily focused on monolingual English-speaking homes, most of whom are also white in this particular community, right? And it should come as no surprise that when we think of converse racialization, we also then see manifestations of anti-Blackness and white settler colonialism in the expansion of dual language education. And so Tyler Elementary School in Washington, D.C., in 2018 had a proposal to convert the school to a dual language school. So it had a dual language strand, and many of the white families wanted it to become a dual language school. So in the dual language program, 34% of the students were white. At the school, 7% of the students were white. Almost all of the other students were African American. And so when African American parents were asked about whether they wanted the school to become a dual language school, they were like, no, right? And you can see here one of the mothers here who argues the more white parents that got involved in the school, they're the ones pushing these agendas. We've always been in that school, and we have never been pushing that agenda. And so we can see here a mother who is quite concerned about the displacement of her children from the school that has been serving the community that she's been in for quite a long time. And bilingualism for all isn't necessarily going to be a helpful mantra in getting that mother on board, right? Bilingualism for all, until you get displaced from the school and the community, is not really a message that's promoting racial equity, right? And to kind of look at kind of some of the white settler colonial logics that produce the expansion of dual language education, we can see in the Utah Dual Language Initiative, which is celebrated by many in the literature because it's a statewide initiative that's promoting dual language programs broadly across the state. There is the Mormon tradition of bilingualism that I think is part of the shaping of that, right, which is connected to kind of missionary work. But Navajo, which, as I said before, was one that in the 60s did have some bilingual programs. It was determined by social scientists to be sophisticated enough that it could have bilingual education programs. But by now, not so much anymore, right? It's not seen as competitive in the global economy. And so Navajo was they are in early discussions of the initiative. By the time the initiative takes off, Navajo is nowhere to be seen anymore. It's not part of the conversation anymore. Um, and so just putting it all together, and then I'll start wrapping up. So the core of expansion of dual language education is converse racialization, which reframes Spanish as a disembodied commodity that belongs to everybody. But I hope I showed you that everyone is not everybody, right? Everybody is a mechanism for catering to the needs of white communities while reifying the racialization of Latinx and other racialized communities. This, I argue, is the newest reconfiguration of colonial logics that maintains racism while espousing anti-racism. So isn't this just strategic? Am I being mean? I mean, it's possible, right? Maybe I am being mean. But I want to reiterate, I'm making a structural argument, not an individual argument. So I had names connected to the discourse, but I'm more interested in the discourse and how this discourse fits into broader structures than the individuals themselves, right? Um, and I'm pointing to the limits of existing structures, right? Not the ways activists navigate these structures. That's a different, interesting study that some people do, right? People are interested in looking at how policymakers, educators navigate structures that are not designed to support the work that they want to do with students. Very interesting and important work, but I would argue it's equally important to critically interrogate the limits of those structures so that we can imagine alternative structures, right? And that both of those things don't have to be in competition with each other. Um, Plus, I would add failing to critically reflect on the strategy, right, no longer makes it strategic. It just becomes the truth that people accept, right? So if we are being strategic, then we need to keep reminding ourselves that we're being strategic in order to not fall into the trap of beginning to believe the discourses that we're using to mobilize in institutions, right? So what are you saying, right? Well, I'm saying we can never deficitize our way out of racial oppression. I'm saying we can never commodify our way out of racial oppression. I'm saying we can never end racial oppression by relying on ideologies that are built on the oppression of Black and Indigenous people, both within and beyond the Latinx community. And I'm saying that instead of trying to achieve whiteness, we find points of solidarity within and across racialized groups that work to dismantle colonial ideologies. Catherine Walsh defines decoloniality as not the absence of coloniality, but rather the serpentine movement towards possibilities of other modes of being, thinking, knowing, sensing, and living, that is, in otherwise in plural. So why bilingual education? Why focus on bilingual education? Because I believe that if bilingual education can help us to understand race in the post-civil rights era, it can also help us in the movement towards these other possibilities, these decolonial futures. And as someone who's done work in bilingual education for some time now, I can say that there are many people in the field that have really cultivated and supported my voice in bringing these critical conversations into our field. Indeed, many senior scholars, in particular Latina scholars, have shared with me their own kind of grappling with the very contradictions that I'm trying to grapple with in my work, and have always encouraged me to continue to push those conversations forward because our generation has different needs and different possibilities than their generation did. And I kind of wanted to end with a special shout out to my dissertation advisor, Ophelia Garcia, who, yeah, you can clap for her. Go ahead, who always told me to trust my voice, to never be afraid to ask the difficult questions, and to continue to look to find alternative worlds, both that already exist in community and worlds that we want to construct in relation with the communities that we work with. So thank you so much.
Hey everyone. I got here 3 minutes late because the nature of AERA structures had me in another hotel. And by the time I got here 3 minutes late, the room was already filled and packed, and that made me very, very excited. I was supposed to introduce Dr. Flores. No, it's okay. There's no way I would not have been here. But there is some space for questions, and I will say really quickly, without taking up too much time, some really important things that you should know about this brilliant scholar. So I had the honor to be the chair of the Early Career Award Committee after having received the award a couple years back. And when we looked at all the amazing folks who got the award, who were nominated for the award, there were a lot of folks doing very important work. And Dr. Flores' work is equal parts practical and tangible, theoretical and relatable, historical and really embedded in the contemporary. I mean, he's just like, damn, you know what I mean? And it's important for me to be able to speak to the excellence of his work and his scholarship and his presence. And I'm particularly excited to do so because we both graduated from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Um, and there was no way I was going to miss saying amazing things about you on the microphone, my dear friend and brilliant scholar. We have about 15 minutes for questions. It's not Vanna White, right? It's maybe like Van Black. I could be. But if you guys have questions for Dr. Flores, this is our time to ask them. Anyone?
Thank you for your presentation. Um, when you look at racial integration in America today, it's not white and black, it's not white and Latinx, it's black and Latinx. I just studied a community outside of Chicago that was historically a black community that is now almost half Latinx, and lots of power struggles of two minoritized communities fighting for power in schools and the curriculum. But one of the solutions was to create a dual language school that was half black and half Latinx. And I'm wondering, is the discourse changing in the sense of racial integration changing? And so is bilingual education then pivoting more towards looking at these communities instead?
Yeah, I mean, so one, I think first we should remind ourselves that there are Black Latinx people too, right? And that we want to be careful about kind of talking about them as distinct categories, but that's true for any ethno-racial category, right? There's always overlap between all of them. But I think that what you're pointing to is a trend that I see in certain communities, right? I think that if you take seriously the idea that we have to be building programs from the bottom up in ways that are sustainable and responsive to the communities that they serve, most African American Latinx kids are in schools together, right? Not with white people, right? And that's just a demographic reality of many of the cities that we work with. Philadelphia certainly is that case. And so I think what that might mean is that the programs need to look different too. I think that if we try to bring in an existing model to a community where that model has never been applied before, it's not going to work, right? We have to really think differently about it. And I don't work, work is not the right word, but like I'm familiar with a school in Philadelphia that serves a primarily African American student population and tried to do a traditional dual language program. And I told them from the beginning, I didn't think that that was the right model. I said, I support and want students to have exposure to languages other than English, but for them to have half of their instruction in content areas in Spanish from the beginning may not be the right model. There may be other ways of thinking about structures that are providing them the enrichment they need while also thinking of ways to incorporate their own linguistic and cultural practices into the curriculum, right? And so I was interested in thinking about what are you doing on the English side to build on the language practices of the African American students in your classroom. And of course, Chris's work could certainly speak to what they should be doing on the English side of the curriculum. But then in Spanish, however that looks, how are you incorporating Blackness into your representations of Spanish in the curriculum, right? Because most dual language schools that I work with haven't thought critically about that. I think the textbooks are not what we want them to be in terms of representation, right? And so then we have to do the work of thinking about how we show students that they are part of the curriculum, that we're building the curriculum based on their knowledge rather than knowledge that we think that they should have in order to be able to maintain anything. Yeah.
how much I read this all right.
I read that one too. Yeah.
If one was in another language or never really my system and never with the comments, but I heard they so don't with people were like how she she needs to go out and experience another culture what the rest of this but it's like they could see that she obviously already got and that didn't put what she'd done, but out of like 1,000 projects, most of them were just super discouraging. Um, Reinstatement of the kind of that we're describing. So I'm curious what we experience in your own, what is projects you see on the outline is what or how like depending on where.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's certainly not my area of research, but yes, I can speak to kind of experiences of it. But I think that I read the story about the Fulbright, right? And I think it's a good illustration of the colonial logics that inform the Fulbright, right? Where it's supposed to be white people working with the other, right? Rather than people who are embedded within those communities being provided with the funds to actually do community-based work with those communities, right? Um, and in terms of higher education, I mean, what I can say, so I think that there are two sides to this coin. On the one side, I can say the more credentials I've gotten, the more people love my bilingualism, right? Because like I'm a doctor and I can speak Spanish, okay, right? But on the other side, there certainly are still interesting interactions. So one that was like in one version of this presentation that I ended up taking out because I thought it was a little petty, but it kind of fits your answer, so I'm going to do it. So there was a prospective doctoral student that was not applying to work with me, that was applying to work with someone in a different program, right? So it's not even educational linguistics, if there's anyone here. But and she was a white woman who had been a dual language teacher for a few years. And so we were talking about our work, and I was talking about my work in bilingual education. And she asks me, but do you know academic Spanish? That was my reaction. I was like, because the people who know me, right? So I was like, well, I think we should critically interrogate that question and what you mean by it and the ideological assumptions that you're making there. And of course, she like left. That was the end of the conversation, and I never saw her again. But so I think that there are these senses that, though yes, my bilingualism is seen as differently than for example some of my cousins who didn't graduate high school, right? Who probably use Spanish more regularly than I do, to be honest. But on the other hand, even within elite spaces, and I think that's getting back to the argument I'm making about the bureaucratization of bilingual education, even when provided access to elite spaces, there's still the marking of otherness, right? That doesn't go away just because you're trying to play by the rules. Any other questions? We still have time. I made sure to reserve 15 minutes for questions, which is why I didn't wait for Chris. I was like, I have 15 minutes for questions, and I need to get going. Yeah.
Uh, that I just finished my research.
Yes, congratulations. She just finished defending her dissertation. Yay.
Uh, Miami that is very particular interesting for bilingual education because 7% of the teachers had bilingual sounds and 70% of the students are bilingual, right? But what's very I observed that there is a hierarchy between the heritage languages inside the schools because the three most spoken languages Spanish, Haitian Creole, and Portuguese. They have different values inside schools. And another interesting fact is that the teachers being bilingual themselves, when they start instructional time, they switch the other to English. So what like your take on that? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think Miami is a very interesting context, mostly because the genealogy of bilingual education in that context is quite distinct from the one that I'm talking about here, mostly because its origins are with Cuban refugees leaving Castro's Cuba, right? And so the racialization that I'm looking at here wasn't necessarily applied in the same way in that context, right? Because the argument was, well, they're going to go back to Cuba once Castro is overthrown, which of course it never happened, right? But the argument was that that was, and so it made sense for them to keep using their Spanish, although Kuroe, which was the school that was done there, was strategically placed in a middle class community too. And so there was a, so I don't know enough about Miami to really get into the specifics. I just know that the genealogy is different. And I think that has led to Spanish being institutionalized in Miami in ways that it hasn't been institutionalized in many other contexts, right? But at the same time, there is, you're pointing to, still this sense of like, even in a context where Spanish actually does provide you access to a lot of spaces that you wouldn't get access to otherwise. That there still is the sense that like English is still the language and Spanish is maybe a second language, and then who cares about Portuguese or Haitian Creole, right? Those aren't even part of the equation at all. Um, and I think the way that I think about it is how do we kind of shift the goal away from trying to achieve whiteness towards thinking about how do you build solidarity with the Haitian Creole communities and the Portuguese communities to kind of disrupt the dominance of the English white hegemony, right? Which I think would look different in Miami than other places because the politics are a little more. I mean, you can support bilingual education in Miami and still be super like conservative in lots of other ways, right? Yes. Hi, how are you?
Or the experiences count down the over the criticism of language has to be fixed.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what, but I'm not sure what. Oh, I see. Right. So, and I think that this is where I think dual language education hasn't disrupted um, at the broad level, right? Because people are certainly doing this, right? But at the broad level, there's still the sense that Spanish is a homogenous thing, and that students need to have certain proficiency in that homogenous thing before they have anything worth maintaining, right? And I think that that sometimes then plays out in terms of which varieties of Spanish are used in the classroom or officially used in the classroom, right? Um, because I think that if you go into many classrooms, like people will say all kinds of things that they do, right? But then what they actually do is something completely different than what they say they do. And that includes kind of people who will say, I only use English. And you go into the classroom and you're like, I heard other things in that classroom. But I think people who say, I only use like Spanish from Real Academia Española. And you're like, I heard you. I don't think that that word is in the Real Academia Española, right? And so, but I think that those contradictions are places that we can begin to have conversations with people, right? Because I don't think that the solution is like what was here. I'm the professional who just knows things, right? And I have this research. You just don't know better, right? That's not the way to approach anybody, right? But I think once you note contradictions, I mean, that's very Freudian, right? Once you note contradictions, you can begin to say, wait, well, you said this thing, but I'm noticing this other thing. What do you think is going on here? Right. Um, so yeah, I don't know if I completely answered your question, but I think that yes, there are hierarchies on both Spanish and English, but I think that in dual language circles, I think we could do a better job of critically interrogating um, which varieties of Spanish are valued, but also thinking about the racialized aspects of why certain varieties are privileged over others, right? So certain varieties that are more associated with Blackness tend to be marginalized, like Puerto Rican and Dominican Spanish, right? And those that are more kind of approximating whiteness in a range of different ways, like Spain, right? And then like Mexico in an interesting kind of way in a lot of the curriculum, right? Then you begin to see, yes, we can't disrupt this without thinking about these broader anti-Black, white settler colonial logics that are informing the construction of these categories. Monica, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, okay. So I'm trying to figure out how to frame this question and thinking about what radical education can teach us about race in the post-civil rights era. I'm thinking about who does research on radical education, who faculty members are, and the amount of people who are like maybe white, non-Latinx people, or are Latinx people that are very fair-skinned, and the absence of people who are brown, like literally brown, and identify as indigenous or black. And like I think how with the absence of an entire group of the population ever being represented, and then in whose faculty members who's doing the research, and that reproducing itself, and all or highly educated immigrants from other countries
Right.
coming in and having those positions. How do you get at some of this nuance? Because like not everyone is willing to talk about the way they benefit from the system.
I don't know how to answer that question. Yes, but one. So I think that the question that you're raising about representation is one that we have to think about more deeply. But that I think that the second level question after we kind of address that issue, which we haven't, right, in bilingual education we haven't, is to understand that one can inhabit a structural position regardless of what one's phenotype may look like, right? And so, but hopefully the goal would be if we bring in people with different experiences into the conversation and kind of center those experiences, that may be a way of beginning to bring more critical attention to the problem of the structural position that has been constructed in a way that disavows their ability to bring their full selves into the conversation, right? But I think that we have to kind of constantly have the representation argument in conversation with the structural argument, or neoliberal multiculturalism could easily take up, like, yay, now we have darker people in bilingual education. The problem has been solved. And they're still saying Dixon Calp, and they're still saying all of these things that we know, or, well, I shouldn't say we, that I believe. Yeah, you and me, yeah, we, but that we would like to disrupt, right? Yes, I saw your hand before you, and I think that's the last question to be you. So make it good.
Struck by there's so many ways to do things bad. And there are many ways that are unstable. Like you create something and then, different analysts try to benefit from it than anyone might expect. I would love to hear examples of Nelson Flores utopia. And then I
So good.
tell like what are some examples? I mean, obviously very different, but like what are some things you've seen where you say this is brilliantly done?
So I don't believe in utopias, right? I bel um, let me think about that one for a second. So I mean, I think that if we shift the locus of enunciation, meaning if we stop kind of centering white perspectives on what communities are doing, I think that the solutions are already there. And I think people are already doing it, right? Like the problems of communication or miscommunication are only problems because institutions produce them as problems. People have been communicating across difference forever, right? And so I think that what we have to do is first shift our perceiving practices, and look to the communities that we purport to serve, and honor and respect their lived experiences and how they're making sense of the world, and then developing approaches around those communities. And I think that people are doing that, right? I think that people do that all of the time. I think that it sometimes gets recognized, it sometimes doesn't get recognized. But yeah, I know that that's a really lame response to the question, but I think that it really is something that needs to be done with communities and by shifting our perceptions away from looking for deficits and l- not finding assets, because assets is also a capitalist metaphor that I'm skeptical of, but taking their meaning making essential to what we do. But that's it. Thank you.